All right, all right, all right. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining. Today, we're going to talk about something that is, I think, quietly reshaping how a lot of companies are growing. For a long time, go-to-market strategy was mostly about channels and pipeline, campaign attribution, and outbound coverage. But what we're seeing now is that the companies that are pulling ahead really understand something different. They understand that their customers' needs and wants better than their competitors, and not necessarily in like a theoretical sense, like in a really truly practical sense. They know what buyers actually say during deals, what customers are struggling with after the purchase, and what outcomes they ultimately care about. And that understanding is actually starting to become a competitive advantage. So, today we're going to look at the trends behind that shift and what that means for how organizations capture and use customer intelligence. So, for those I haven't met yet, my name is Shauna Sumawang. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Dito. I've spent more than 20 years working in marketing leadership roles, and a lot of that has been focused on customer programs, community programs, lifecycle marketing, and demand. And the one thing that I've noticed across pretty much every company I've worked with is that pretty much every company wants to say that they're customer centric. And if you've joined my webinars before, you've heard me say this. But very few companies actually build systems that learn from their customers continuously. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, because a lot of the insight lives in scattered places, sales calls, support conversations, product feedback. And I think the opportunity that's available for all of us now today is figuring out how to connect that knowledge so that the whole company can learn from its customers. So here's how we'll spend the time today. First, we'll talk about the core problem most organizations run into when they try to use customer insight. Then we'll talk through some of the data from practitioner interviews. So Dito actually conducted an industry survey where we actually used our own AI interview agent to go out and interview practitioners in the space to get feedback on kind of their go-to customer trends for the year. So we'll talk a little bit about what we saw in that. And from there, we'll talk about the role that AI is starting to play in this space. We'll then introduce a framework for how customer relationship intelligence actually flows through an organization. And finally, we'll look at a maturity model that helps you think about where your company might be today. And again, we only have 30 minutes, so we're going to go through a lot of these concepts pretty quickly, but we do have a report that we also just published that we will also share out with you after the webinar as well, so that you can go into it in a little bit more depth on your own. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. So, the core idea behind everything we're going to discuss is that this customer knowledge already exists inside of most companies. Again, sales is hearing it on calls, customer success sees it in adoption patterns, support probably hears it in the tickets that they're getting from customers, and product may be hearing it even in the product feedback that they're getting. So the challenge isn't that companies aren't collecting information from their customers. I think for most organizations, the challenge is coordinating it. Most organizations have signals everywhere, but they don't really have a system that connects them. And as companies become more AI driven, that gap becomes even more evident. So, as I mentioned, we spoke with practitioners across marketing, sales, product, and customer teams. And the patterns were surprisingly consistent. About a third said finding customer insight is difficult. Another third said knowledge exists, but it's siloed across teams. So it's likely many of you on the webinar line can relate to some of this. And a large portion said that data lives across multiple systems. One person even verbatim said something that really stuck with me. They said, "We have more customer data than ever before, but it's never been harder to find the one thing that we actually need." And I think that that captures the reality pretty well. So, if you map where customer insight lives inside of most companies, it's everywhere. Again, we've talked about these, but sales conversations, they live in call recording platforms like Gong. Support issues live in ticketing systems, and product feedback shows up pretty much through all sorts of channels, Slack threads or feature requests. And customer stories live in marketing folders, whether they're in Dropbox or Box. And every team captures something, but very few organizations have connected those signals together, which means that insights can get lost even though the data exists. So when we asked, oops, sorry, one second, gotta progress the slide. So when we asked practitioners where customer insight is the most valuable, three areas stood out. Sales is obviously a big one. Reps constantly need proof during deals, customer stories, reference outcomes, but finding the right example at the right moment is often, for a lot of organizations, still very manual. And references came up a lot too. This is where we hear one story over and over and over again. And in a lot of companies, oftentimes the same two or three customers end up doing every reference call for your company. And eventually they burn out. The sales team keeps asking for help. The customer marketing team keeps trying to protect the relationship, and everyone feels this unnecessary tension today. And it's a classic example of a process that works well at a small scale, but then breaks once the company starts to grow. Some of the comments we heard during the interviews were very direct. One practitioner said that finding customer insight today feels almost impossible, again, because there's no consistent process. Another said the information exists, but it's scattered and it's hard to access quickly. And one quote that I really liked is that there's great intent, but not so great execution. So many companies genuinely want to learn from their customers, they just haven't operationalized it yet. And so this brings us to AI. I know everyone's talking about AI, and AI is getting a lot of attention right now, but it's important to understand what role it actually plays. AI is not a replacement for customer understanding. It is an amplifier. So AI systems are only as good as the knowledge they can access. And if customer insight is fragmented, AI will just summarize fragmented insights. But if that knowledge is structured and connected, and that is when AI can truly become powerful for your company. So let's dig in a little bit. A recent McKinsey survey found that almost 90% of organizations are using AI somewhere in their business, but less than 40% say it's producing meaningful financial impact. And that gap tells us something. Most companies adopt AI tools before they've organized their data. And one example we hear consistently comes from win-loss analysis. So if you take a look at CRM fields, a huge percentage of deals say that they were lost because of pricing. But when you actually talk to buyers, pricing wasn't the real reason. Maybe the product didn't solve the problem clearly, or maybe the buyer didn't trust the implementation path, or maybe the competitor told a stronger story. But the CRM says pricing. But the real insight lives in those conversations that you're having with your customers. And that's where AI can help, again, if those signals are being captured. So, what does a better system look like? The idea behind customer relationship orchestration is simple: capture signals, structure intelligence, and activate those insights. Instead of running isolated programs like surveys, reference programs, or feedback loops, organizations can build a system that continuously learns from its customers. This slide shows how that learning system works. So again, it starts with interactions, support conversations, sales calls, product feedback. Those interactions produce signals. Signals like sentiment, adoption patterns, friction points, maybe even advocacy signals. When those signals are structured and analyzed, they become intelligence. Patterns, proof points, risk indicators, and then that intelligence gets activated across the business. So sales uses it during deals, product uses it for roadmap decisions, customer teams use it for retention, and marketing can use it to tell credible stories. So a helpful way to evaluate your organization is simply to ask a few questions. Uh, do we understand how customer relationships are evolving? Can teams access customer insight when they need it? Are we learning from the full range of interactions customers have with us? And are we activating that insight across teams? And again, I know these questions sound simple, but when leadership teams actually try to answer them, the gap becomes very, very clear. So try it out with them. Based on what you saw in kind of some of the research and as we started to double click into it, organizations tend to move through a maturity curve. And again, we'll share this out with the full report after this webinar so you can double click into it because again, I know we don't have a lot of time today. But most folks start in a fragmented world. Some move into collecting feedback, but the real shift happens when signals become structured intelligence that multiple teams can access. Eventually, the most mature companies orchestrate their customer relationships strategically across the business. Most organizations, though, today, as you can see, are still in the first two stages. The companies that figure this out start making better decisions faster, not because they have better dashboards, but because they understand their customers more clearly. And so when we looked at companies that are actually good at learning from customers, three patterns showed up pretty consistently. The first is that they treat customer knowledge as infrastructure, not content. Most companies treat customer insights like marketing assets, case studies, testimonials, quotes, reference lists, right? But the companies doing this well treat customer insight more like a data system. Every customer interaction becomes something that the organization can learn from. A simple test that I often suggest is this. If somebody walks up to product or sales and asks, what are customers actually saying about this? How long does it take to find a concrete answer? Again, try it out in your organization. In strong organizations, it can take seconds. But for most companies, it often requires pulling together a meeting from folks across the organization. The second thing that they do differently is that they make customer insights move across teams. Again, support hears things that product maybe never sees. Sales hears objections that marketing never hears, and customer success sees adoption patterns that again, sales and leadership never see. So leading organizations deliberately connect those signals. And sometimes it's as simple as a weekly voice of customer loop where teams share patterns that they're seeing. The important part is that the learning doesn't stay in one department. The third difference is that they use AI to analyze customer signals at scale, not to replace human thinking, but to do something that humans can't do. It is quite impossible to look across thousands of conversations and find patterns. So one of my favorite examples, again, I talked about this scenario a little bit earlier, it's win-loss. Again, if you open most CRMs, a huge percentage of deals that are lost are labeled close loss because of pricing. But when companies actually analyze buyer conversations, pricing usually isn't the real reason. The real issue is things like unclear differentiation, implementation risks, or lack of internal consensus. But your CRM says pricing. And so the conversations, the real conversations always say something else. And that's exactly the kind of pattern that AI is good at surfacing when customer signals are structured. So if there's one takeaway from this slide, it is this. The organizations that are learning the fastest from customers aren't collecting more feedback. They're making the insight usable across the business. So if you zoom out, there are six big takeaways. Customer knowledge already exists inside of most organizations. Customer relationships produce signals that, again, traditional systems, they just were not designed to capture holistically. And AI is increasing the value of structured knowledge. So, leading companies treat customer relationships as intelligence. And coordinating these relationships is becoming a core capability. The competitive frontier, I think, for all of us is shifting. Companies are moving from managing transactions to really understanding relationships. So the if this resonates, I think the natural question is where do you start? And we usually recommend kind of three practical steps. The first is an audit where customer knowledge lives today. And this exercise is often eye-opening. Ask a few simple questions internally. Where do sales conversations live? Where does support feedback live? Where does product feedback live? Where do customer stories live? And I think most companies realize very quickly that the signals are scattered across five or six different systems. The goal of the audit isn't to fix everything immediately, it's just to understand the landscape. The second step is structure the signals so that they become usable intelligence. Right now, most companies capture conversations, but never organize them. So, a simple first move might be something like tagging or categorizing customer insights. Things like what problems customers mention most often, which competitors show up in deals, which outcomes customers care the most about. Once that information becomes searchable, teams can stop guessing and they start learning from those patterns. The third step is activate insights in the moments that matter. And this is where customer intelligence actually starts to influence decisions. As an example, sales reps can surface the right customer story during a deal, and product teams maybe can start to see recurring feature requests. Maybe marketing can actually anchor messaging in real customer language. The key shift is that customer insights moves from something you review quarterly to something that teams are able to use every day. And the companies that get this right tend to move faster, not because they have better dashboards, but because they understand that what their customers are telling them in real time. So, again, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I wanted to make sure we saved a few minutes for Q&A from the audience, if there are a few. And if you want a deeper dive into the research and the frameworks that we discussed, the full report is going to be available in the Dito Hub. And we'll also make sure that for webinar participants that we send you a link to that as well. With that, I'd love to open it up for a few questions and just also hear about folks' individual experiences on this front. All right. So we have a couple questions that have come through already. One wanted to understand a little bit more about the research that Dito did specifically. So again, we reached out to the practitioners that are in our network. So we reached out to a few thousand folks that are in our database. And again, we actually used Dito. Dito has the ability to set up campaigns that essentially reach out and conduct AI interviews. So we use that capability from the Dito platform and reached out to both customers and those that are just in the industry, even if they aren't customers, to get their perspectives. And we got a few hundred responses. So again, thank you to everyone that participated in that and got to go through that AI interview workflow and see it firsthand. And then we actually use the Dito MCP server to actually query against all of those responses to put together some of the insights that you guys saw today in the webinar. And it's also, again, in the report as well. I see a question about will we get these slides after? We'll definitely share out the recording. And like I said, a lot of the insights and data is also incorporated in the report that we just put together. It is a 30-page report, but hopefully it's valuable and hopefully you can use it internally within your own organization. But if you'd also like the slides, just definitely go ahead and let us know. We can send that to you as well. All right. We have a question around how do you get how do you get leadership buy-in on potentially investing in a tool like this versus trying to build it internally? This is a great question, and it's one I think a lot of us are potentially coming up against inside of our own organizations. Again, every organization's culture is a little bit different. Some cultures are really leaning into AI, and some are still, a little anti-AI and trying to make sure that they're stepping into it with all the right safety protocols in place. And I will say, as someone who notoriously uses Claude Cowork on a daily basis, it's an extremely powerful tool. So, for those of you that haven't played with it, you definitely should. And those that have probably know how powerful it is and how quickly it can, again, kind of spin up interfaces that feel very polished in terms of helping you to kind of manage some of the things that you're doing in your day-to-day work. And for that, Claude Cowork is absolutely amazing. Where I think it still makes sense to go to your leadership team, though, in terms of making an investment, is candidly at the intersection when you have to start to interact with your customers. I think it's important to remember that, Claude Cowork is really meant for individual tool usage today and isn't necessarily designed to be a great representation of your organization. And so I think that there are things that you have to take into consideration just in terms of making sure that the face that you're putting forward to your customers is always world class. That experience, the ability to build continuous relationships with your customers, is something that, at the current moment, anyways, a lot of the LLM tools just aren't necessarily capable of building upon that continuous relationship and making sure that every engagement with the customers kind of brings that to the forefront. So those are some of the things. Again, if you'd like a full comparison, please reach out and let me know. I'm happy to share with you sort of how to think about kind of the build versus buy and how to talk to your leadership team about potential investments on this front. Um, all right, let's see. Looks like we have one more question. And again, if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A section of the webinar panel, and we'll crank through them. But I have one additional question in the queue right now. So wanted to understand how companies are kind of moving through the maturity model that we saw. And again, I know we blazed through that pretty quickly. There are definitely more in-depth recommendations in the report in terms of how do you go from kind of that fragmented nature all the way to a more orchestrated state. So definitely check out the report. It's got some great insights about kind of being able to step ladder yourself through that maturity curve. And hopefully you find that helpful. All right. Well, it looks like we've made it through the questions. Again, thank you guys so much for joining today. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was valuable. Like I said, we'll send out the webinar recording and the report after this. But thank you so much for the time today.